Hyunjin's heart shatters after witnessing Felix embrace a mysterious stranger, forcing both of them to face hidden truths and fragile trust. The bouquet slipped from Hyunjin's trembling fingers the exact moment Felix wrapped his arms around someone else beneath the glowing streetlights, and for one unbearable second, the entire world seemed to stop breathing. The laughter from nearby cafes faded into distant echoes. Rainwater glistened across the pavement, reflecting golden lights that blurred beneath Hyunjin's unfocused eyes. His chest tightened so suddenly that even drawing a single breath felt impossible. He had rehearsed this evening countless times. After weeks of exhausting schedules, endless rehearsals, and sleepless nights, he had finally gathered enough courage to surprise Felix. Nothing extravagant, just his favorite flowers, warm, sweet bread from the bakery Felix always visited after practice, and a quiet evening together away from cameras and expectations. Instead, destiny handed him a scene he had never imagined. Felix was smiling, not the polite smile he wore during interviews, not the playful grin he gave fans. This smile was different. It was soft, warm, almost relieved. And then Felix embraced someone. The stranger looked slightly older than them, dressed in a dark coat soaked by the gentle rain. His face remained partially hidden beneath the hood, but Felix held him tightly as if they had been separated for years. Hyunjin stood frozen. His fingers loosened. The bouquet hit the wet pavement with a quiet splash. Neither of them noticed. Something inside him cracked without making a sound. For years, Hyunjin had hidden his emotions behind jokes, teasing remarks, and effortless confidence. Everyone believed he was fearless, expressive, impossible to discourage. The truth was painfully different. Since childhood, he had carried a silent fear of being left behind. Friends moved away, promises disappeared. People he trusted often chose someone else. Every goodbye carved another invisible scar inside his heart until he eventually convinced himself never to expect too much from anyone, except Felix. Felix had quietly become the exception. Without realizing it, Hyunjin had started measuring good days by Felix's laughter. Bad days became easier whenever Felix sat beside him without saying anything. Silence with Felix never felt empty. It felt like home. That was why this single embrace hurt more than he thought possible. Across the street, Felix finally stepped back from the stranger. His bright freckles seemed even softer beneath the rain. He smiled again before saying something Hyunjin couldn't hear. The mysterious man laughed. Hyunjin couldn't force himself to listen anymore. He turned away. Each step felt heavier than the last. Rain soaked through his jacket, but he barely noticed. Inside his mind, questions collided endlessly. Who was he? Why had Felix never mentioned him? Why did that hug feel so intimate? Was there already someone occupying the place Hyunjin had secretly hoped to earn? By the time he reached the dorm, the rain had become a storm. The others were scattered around the living room, watching movies and eating snacks between conversations. Bang Chan immediately noticed the soaked jacket. "You look terrible," he said gently. "I'm just tired." It was a convincing lie. Hyunjin had mastered lying about his own pain years ago. He excused himself and quietly entered his room. The silence waiting there felt colder than the rain outside. He placed the untouched bakery bag on his desk. The bread had already gone cold. He stared at the flowers. Several petals had fallen off during the walk home. "Just flowers," he whispered to himself. Yet somehow they looked exactly how his heart felt. Hours later, the front door opened. Felix returned. His cheerful greeting echoed through the hallway. Normally, Hyunjin would immediately walk out to tease him. Tonight, he remained seated on the floor beside his bed. He listened carefully as Felix laughed with the others. The familiar sound, once comforting, now carried an unfamiliar distance. A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Hyunjin," Felix's voice, no answer, another knock. "Are you asleep?" Hyunjin closed his eyes. If he spoke now, his voice would betray him. After several quiet seconds, the footsteps slowly disappeared. He hated himself for staying silent. He hated himself even more for wanting Felix to knock one more time. Morning arrived beneath gray skies. Practice continued as usual. Music thundered through the studio. Choreography demanded perfect synchronization. Hyunjin never missed a beat, neither did Felix. To everyone else, nothing had changed. Only the brief glances between them carried invisible weight. Whenever Felix smiled in his direction, Hyunjin instinctively looked away. Whenever Felix tried standing beside him during breaks, Hyunjin quietly found another excuse to move. Felix noticed. Of course he noticed. Felix always noticed small things. He noticed when someone skipped breakfast, when someone forced a smile. When someone laughed louder than necessary, he noticed Hyunjin's silence immediately. That evening, after everyone else had left the practice room, Felix finally spoke. "Did I do something wrong?" Hyunjin kept folding his jacket. "No, you've barely looked at me all day. I'm just exhausted." Felix stepped closer, never hidden behind that excuse before. Several long seconds, only the humming air conditioner filled the room. Then Hyunjin laughed quietly. It wasn't a happy laugh. It sounded tired. "If someone important suddenly appeared in your life," Hyunjin asked without meeting Felix's eyes, "would you tell me?" Felix frowned. "What do you mean?" Hyunjin finally looked at him. His smile had completely disappeared. "I saw you." Felix's expression changed instantly. "Saw what?" "You hugged someone." Silence, not awkward silence, heavy silence. The kind that presses against every heartbeat. Felix inhaled slowly. His eyes reflected surprise, guilt, and something deeper Hyunjin couldn't quite understand. "I wanted to tell you." Hyunjin forced another smile. "But you didn't." The words landed softly, yet they hurt far more than shouting ever could. Neither of them realized that the misunderstanding beginning with a single embrace would quietly unravel forgotten promises, hidden family secrets, and truths neither of them had been ready to face until that rainy night changed everything. Felix remained standing in the center of the empty practice room. His lips parted as though countless explanations had gathered there, but none of them knew how to become words. The mirrors surrounding them reflected two familiar faces separated by only a few steps, yet the distance felt greater than anything either of them had experienced before. Hyunjin slipped his jacket over his shoulders. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. "I do. You really don't." "I wasn't hiding him because I don't trust you." Hyunjin finally looked up, and the sadness in his eyes made Felix's chest tighten. "Then why?" Felix lowered his gaze. "'Cause I was afraid." Answer surprised Hyunjin more than anger ever could. Felix had always been the one who smiled through difficult days, the one who comforted everyone else before admitting his own worries. Seeing uncertainty written across his face felt almost unnatural. "Afraid of what?" Hyunjin asked. Felix rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he unconsciously fell into whenever memories became too heavy. "Afraid that once you knew, things would change." Hyunjin gave a faint, humorless smile. "They already have." Those words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. Felix wanted to reach for him, but something held him back. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the realization that silence had already created wounds deeper than he had imagined. "Tell you everything," Felix whispered. "Tonight." Hyunjin walked past him. As their shoulders brushed, Felix instinctively reached out, but his fingers stopped just before touching Hyunjin's sleeve. He let his hand fall. Outside, the city was alive with lights and passing traffic, yet Hyunjin barely noticed any of it. He wandered aimlessly through quiet streets, letting the cool night air calm the storm inside him. His thoughts refused to settle. He replayed the hug over and over, the warmth in Felix's expression, the relief in his smile, the familiarity between them. Each memory planted another seed of doubt. Eventually, he found himself standing beside the Han River. The water moved calmly beneath the moonlight, carrying reflections that shattered whenever the current shifted. Hyunjin leaned against the railing. As a child, whenever he felt overwhelmed, he had searched for places where water flowed endlessly. Watching rivers reminded him that nothing remained frozen forever. Not happiness, not pain, not people. Still, that thought offered little comfort tonight. He pulled his phone from his pocket. Several unread messages waited for him. Most were from the members asking where he had gone. One message stood out. "Felix, can we please talk?" Hyunjin stared at the screen for nearly a minute before locking the phone without replying. Not because he wanted to ignore Felix, because he didn't trust himself to answer honestly. Back at the dorm, Felix sat alone in the living room long after everyone had gone to bed. Bang Chan quietly approached and placed a mug of warm tea on the table. "Been sitting here for almost an hour." Felix smiled weakly. "I know, you and Hyunjin argued." Felix remained silent. Bang Chan didn't press him. Instead, he sat beside him, allowing the silence to breathe. After several moments, Felix finally spoke. "Have you ever wanted to protect someone so badly that you accidentally hurt them instead?" Bang Chan nodded slowly. "Then once." Felix rested his elbows on his knees. "I thought waiting was the right thing. Now, I think waiting became another kind of lie." Bang Chan looked toward the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Some truths don't become easier with time." Felix closed his eyes. I know. The next morning, the group's schedule took them to a television studio. Hairstylists rushed between dressing rooms, managers checked schedules, cameras rolled endlessly. Everything moved with familiar precision. To everyone watching, the members looked exactly as they always had, professional, energetic, close. Only those who knew them well would notice that Hyunjin and Felix never accidentally stood beside each other anymore. Whenever the cameras stopped recording, an invisible space remained between them. It was subtle, painfully subtle. During lunch, Felix quietly carried 2 bottled drinks from the vending machine. Without thinking, he placed one beside Hyunjin. Hyunjin thanked him politely, nothing more. That single moment hurt Felix more than any argument. Courtesy had replaced comfort. Across the room, Changbin watched the exchange with growing concern. Pretending too hard, he murmured. No one disagreed. Late that afternoon, Hyunjin walked toward the parking area alone. As he stepped outside, a familiar black car was waiting across the street. The same one he had seen on the rainy night. The passenger door opened. The mysterious man stepped out. This time, Hyunjin saw his face clearly. He looked older than Felix by several years, with gentle eyes and a tired smile that carried traces of countless untold stories. The man noticed Hyunjin immediately. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then the stranger bowed politely. You must be Hyunjin. Hyunjin's heartbeat quickened. You know my name, the man smiled softly. Felix talks about you all the time. Those simple words should have brought relief. Instead, they only deepened the confusion. Before Hyunjin could ask another question, the man reached into his coat and carefully removed a small, worn envelope. Been hopping to meet you, he said. There is something that Felix wanted to tell you, but he never found the courage. Hyunjin looked at the old envelope without taking it. Its edges were faded with age, as though it had been carried for years. What is it? The man's expression grew unexpectedly solemn. It's a promise. Hyunjin frowned. A promise made long before either of you realized how important it would become. Hyunjin stared at the weathered envelope without moving. Its corners were softened by time, and faint creases ran across the paper as though it had been opened and closed countless times before finally finding its way into the stranger's hands. What kind of promise? He asked quietly. The man looked down at the envelope for a long moment before answering. A promise between families. Hyunjin's eyebrows drew together. My family, the man nodded. Yes. A cool breeze swept through the parking lot, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the scent of approaching rain. Everything around Hyunjin suddenly felt strangely unreal. I don't understand. You weren't supposed to know yet. Then why tell me now? The man released a slow breath. Because waiting has already caused enough pain. He finally held the envelope out. My name is Daniel. Hyunjin accepted the envelope with hesitant hands. It was surprisingly light. Inside, he found an old photograph. 2 young boys stood beneath a cherry blossom tree, laughing as pink petals floated around them. One of them was unmistakably Felix, several years younger, his freckles already visible beneath a bright smile, the other child. Hyunjin froze. His own face looked back at him. He searched his memory desperately. Nothing. Don't remember this. Daniel smiled sadly. You were both very young. Hyunjin turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were only a few words. No matter how far life takes you, find each other again. Below the sentence were 2 signatures. One belonged to Felix's mother, the other. Hyunjin recognized his own mother's handwriting immediately. His heartbeat quickened. My mother never mentioned this. Wanted to protect you. From what? Daniel hesitated. From losing someone important again. Before Hyunjin could ask another question, his phone vibrated. Felix. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Daniel gave him a gentle nod. You should answer. Hyunjin finally accepted the call. Hello, Felix's voice sounded anxious. Where are you? Outside the studio. There. Felix, I'm coming. The call ended. Only a few minutes later, Felix appeared, breathing heavily as though he had run through the entire building. His eyes immediately landed on the photograph in Hyunjin's hands. For an instant, all the color drained from his face. You showed him, Felix whispered. Daniel lowered his head. He deserved the truth. Felix closed his eyes. I wanted to tell him myself. I know. Hyunjin looked from one to the other. Will someone please explain what's happening? Felix remained silent for several moments before stepping closer. When I was little, he began softly, my family lived next door to yours. Hyunjin looked at the photograph again. We were neighbors, Felix nodded. We spent almost every day together. I don't remember. You were only 6. Felix smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind it. You used to drag me outside whenever it rained because you believed puddles were tiny oceans. Despite everything, Hyunjin felt the corner of his mouth lift ever so slightly. That sounds like something I'd do. You insisted every paper boat deserved a captain. A tiny fragment of memory flickered in Hyunjin's mind. Rain, laughter, small paper boats floating down a narrow stream beside a sidewalk, then it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I almost remember. Felix's eyes brightened. You do, only pieces. Felix looked relieved, but it lasted only a moment. Everything changed after your family moved away. My parents told me we moved because of my father's work. Daniel and Felix exchanged a brief glance. Neither answered immediately. Hyunjin noticed. That's not the whole story, is it? Felix slowly shook his head. No. Silence that followed carried years of unspoken memories. My mother and your mother promised that if life ever separated us, Felix said, we would find each other again someday. Hyunjin looked down at the old photograph once more. So, we already knew each other before becoming trainees. Why didn't you tell me after recognizing me? Felix's expression became clouded with guilt. Because you didn't recognize me. Hyunjin blinked. I was afraid. Afraid I'd reject you, Felix smiled sadly. No, his voice dropped almost to a whisper. I was afraid I'd remind you of the worst day of your childhood. The word struck Hyunjin with unexpected force. Worst day, Daniel looked toward the gray sky. It wasn't only a move, Hyunjin. What do you mean? Felix swallowed hard. Day your family left. His hands trembled slightly. Was the same day you were in an accident. Hyunjin's breathing stopped. An accident. A headache pulsed suddenly behind his eyes. Broken flashes appeared without warning, rain pounding against a windshield. Someone shouting his name, shattered glass. A child's frightened cry. His knees weakened. Felix instinctively caught his arm before he could lose his balance. The moment their eyes met, another fragment of memory surfaced. A small hand gripping his tightly. A trembling voice saying, "Don't let go." Hyunjin looked at Felix in stunned silence. His heart recognized something his memories still struggled to reach. And for the first time since that rainy night, he realized that the hug he had mistaken for betrayal had been hiding a past far more complicated and far more painful than he had ever imagined.
Hyunjin did not pull his arm away. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The city continued moving around them. Cars passed, people hurried along the sidewalks, and distant laughter drifted through the evening air. But everything beyond the two of them faded into a blur. Felix slowly loosened his grip. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted you to remember it like this." Hyunjin pressed a hand against his temple. The sharp ache behind his eyes refused to disappear. Tiny fragments of the past flashed through his mind, disappearing before he could hold on to them. "I keep seeing rain," he murmured. Felix nodded. "It was raining that day. I hear someone crying." Felix's eyes filled with emotion. "That was me." Hyunjin looked at him in disbelief. "You were there. I never left." The words settled heavily between them. Daniel quietly stepped back, sensing that the conversation no longer belonged to him. Felix took a slow breath. "Accident happened only a few streets away from our old neighborhood. Your parents' car lost control on the wet road." Hyunjin closed his eyes. A loud screech echoed inside his head, then darkness. "When I heard what happened," Felix continued, "I ran to the hospital with my mother." Another memory surfaced, bright white lights, the smell of disinfectant, someone holding a tiny paper crane, a familiar voice saying, "You'll get better, I'll wait for you." Hyunjin's breathing became uneven. Paper crane. Felix smiled sadly. "You remembered, you made it. I folded one every day while you were in the hospital." Hyunjin stared at him. "You visited me, every single day." His voice trembled, "Even when you couldn't recognize anyone." Hyunjin felt his throat tighten. "So why don't I remember you?" "The doctors said the trauma affected parts of your memory. They told your parents not to force you to remember." Felix lowered his gaze. "When your family moved away after you recovered, I wanted to say goodbye." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "But your parents left before I arrived." Hyunjin imagined a young Felix standing outside an empty house, clutching paper cranes with no one left to give them to. The image broke something inside him. "I'm sorry," Hyunjin whispered. Felix shook his head immediately. "You have nothing to apologize for. You waited all these years." "I wasn't waiting because I expected anything." He smiled faintly. "I just hoped you were happy." Sincerity in Felix's voice made Hyunjin realize how deeply he had misunderstood him. The jealousy that had consumed him since that rainy evening suddenly felt painfully small compared to the years of silent loyalty Felix had carried. "There is still something you don't know," Daniel said softly. Both of them turned toward him. Man Hyunjin saw that night. Hyunjin's heartbeat quickened again. Wasn't someone Felix loved the way you imagined? Felix rubbed the back of his neck. Daniel continued gently. Felix's older cousin. Hyunjin blinked. Cousin, Felix nodded with an embarrassed smile. I hadn't seen him in almost 8 years. He had just returned from overseas, Daniel explained. That hug was our first meeting in a very long time. Hyunjin lowered his head. Every assumption he had made collapsed in an instant. I thought. I know what you thought, Felix said quietly. I should have trusted you enough to ask. I should have trusted you enough to tell you. The first time in days they both smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge still under construction. As twilight settled over the city, Daniel reached into his coat once more. Almost forgot. He handed Felix a small wooden box. Felix accepted it carefully. Been keeping this for years, Daniel said. It belongs to both of you. Felix opened the lid. Inside rested 2 tiny paper cranes. Though faded with age, they had been preserved with extraordinary care. One had the letter F written in blue ink, the other carried the letter H. Hyunjin stared at them, unable to speak. I folded the first one, Felix said softly. You folded the second. I did, Felix nodded. You told me that paper cranes never forget the people who make them. Hyunjin smiled through eyes that had begun to glisten. I really said that. You were very serious about it. A quiet laugh escaped both of them. For the first time since the misunderstanding began, the weight on Hyunjin's heart eased. Yet as he reached toward the tiny paper crane marked with his initial, something slipped from beneath it. A folded piece of yellowed paper. Felix frowned. Never seen that before. Daniel looked equally surprised. It wasn't there the last time I opened the box. Hyunjin carefully unfolded the fragile note. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakably old. It was addressed to both of them. If you are reading this together, then our wish has finally come true. Some promises survive distance, time, and even forgotten memories. But there is one truth we could never bring ourselves to tell you. When the accident happened, someone made a sacrifice that changed both of your lives forever. Someday, when you are ready, you deserve to know why. There was no signature. Only a single date written at the bottom, the date of the accident. Hyunjin read the letter again, slower this time, as though the meaning might change if he gave each word enough patience. Someone made a sacrifice that changed both of your lives forever. Sentence lingered in his mind. He looked up at Felix. Do you know what this means? Felix slowly shook his head. No. Daniel's expression had turned unusually serious. Never seen that letter before. Your mother's only asked me to keep the box safe. Hyunjin folded the fragile note with careful hands. It has to be someone who knew about the accident. Felix nodded, but uncertainty clouded his eyes. There aren't many people left who do. The 3 of them stood in silence until Daniel finally spoke. There is one person. Who? An elderly nurse. Hyunjin frowned. The nurse who looked after you during your recovery. Felix immediately recognized the name. Nurse Yuna, Daniel nodded. She retired years ago, but she stayed in contact with both of your families for a long time. Hyunjin's heartbeat quickened. If anyone knows what this letter is talking about, it's probably her, Felix finished. 2 days later, after clearing a rare free afternoon in their schedules, Hyunjin and Felix drove to a quiet coastal town where Nurse Yuna had settled after retirement. The journey was peaceful. Fields stretched endlessly beyond the highway, and the sea shimmered beneath a sky washed in soft blue. Neither of them spoke much. Oddly, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Every now and then, Felix glanced toward Hyunjin, as if reassuring himself that he was really there. Hyunjin noticed. He smiled faintly. I'm not disappearing. Felix laughed quietly. I know. It's just... What? I spent years wondering if we'd ever find each other again. Hyunjin looked out the window. And now we're searching for our past together. Felix nodded. Together. The word carried a warmth that eased something deep inside Hyunjin. By late afternoon, they arrived at a small white cottage overlooking the ocean. The garden was filled with lavender swaying gently in the breeze. An elderly woman was watering flowers near the entrance. She looked up as their footsteps approached. For a brief moment, she simply stared. Then her watering can slipped from her hands. Hyunjin, her voice trembled. She turned toward Felix. And Felix, tears immediately filled her eyes. You really came back. Felix bowed respectfully. It's been a long time, Nurse Yuna. She smiled through her tears. Far too long. Inside the cottage, the scent of herbal tea filled the warm living room. Photographs lined the shelves. Among them were several pictures of children playing beneath cherry blossom trees. Hyunjin stopped in front of one frame. 2 boys, paper boats, rain boots. Laughter frozen in time. You kept these? He asked. I could never throw them away, Nurse Yuna replied. They reminded me that miracles sometimes happen. She invited them to sit. For a while they talked about ordinary things, health, work, the members, the weather. It was obvious she already sensed why they had come. Eventually, Hyunjin placed the folded letter on the table. Her smile disappeared. She recognized it instantly. You found it. You've seen this before, she nodded slowly. I wrote it. Hyunjin's breath caught. Hoped you would discover it together one day. Felix leaned forward. What sacrifice was the letter talking about? Nurse Yuna remained silent for several moments. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. Accident was much worse than either of you were ever told. Hyunjin felt his hands grow cold. Doctors weren't sure you would survive. Another forgotten memory flashed before him. A hospital ceiling, machines beeping, someone crying outside the room. You remained unconscious for several days, she continued. Felix refused to leave the hospital. Felix lowered his eyes. I remember. You were only a child. Nurse Yuna smiled sadly. Every morning you asked me the same question. She looked directly at Hyunjin. Has he opened his eyes yet? Hyunjin couldn't stop the tears gathering in his eyes. You really stayed. Felix nodded quietly. I promised I would. Nurse Yuna reached into an old wooden cabinet and carefully removed a faded notebook. Its cover had become worn with age. I think it's time you read this. She handed it to Hyunjin. What is it? Felix's diary. Felix looked surprised. I thought that disappeared. Kept it because I believed one day Hyunjin deserved to know. Hyunjin hesitated before opening the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a young child. The letters were uneven, some words misspelled. The first entry made his vision blur. Today Hyunjin didn't wake up. I told him about the birds outside anyway because maybe he could still hear me. He turned another page. Doctor said I should go home. I said no because Hyunjin might wake up while I'm gone. Another page. I folded another paper crane today. If I make one every day, maybe he'll come back sooner. Hyunjin's tears slipped silently onto the yellowed paper. He could almost picture a frightened little boy sitting beside a hospital bed, refusing to give up hope. The final page contained only one short sentence. If Hyunjin forgets me, I'll remember enough for both of us. Room fell completely silent. Hyunjin slowly closed the diary. He looked at Felix, whose eyes were already wet with tears. Without saying a single word, Hyunjin stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him. This time there was no misunderstanding, no jealousy, no unanswered questions, only two hearts finally finding the peace of themselves they had unknowingly been searching for since childhood. The embrace lasted longer than either of them realized. Neither Hyunjin nor Felix spoke. They didn't need to. The years that had separated them, the forgotten memories, and the misunderstandings that had quietly built walls between them all seemed to dissolve in the quiet warmth of that single moment. Nurse Yuna watched them with gentle eyes. Waited a very long time to see this, she said softly. Hyunjin slowly stepped back, wiping the tears from his face with an embarrassed smile. I can't believe I forgot all of this. Nurse Yuna shook her head. You didn't choose to forget. Felix looked at Hyunjin. And I chose not to remind you. Hyunjin frowned slightly. Why? Felix lowered his gaze. Because I didn't want our friendship to exist because of an old promise. Answer surprised everyone in the room. Felix continued quietly. I wanted you to choose me because of who I am now. Not because we shared a childhood you couldn't even remember. Hyunjin felt his chest tighten. So all these years, I kept waiting for the right moment. He laughed softly. But every time I almost told you, I convinced myself it wasn't important. It was important. I know. Felix smiled sadly. I realized that too late. Nurse Yuna stood and walked toward a bookshelf near the window. From the highest shelf she carefully picked up a small glass jar. Inside were dozens of colorful paper stars. She placed the jar on the table. You remember these? Hyunjin looked confused. Felix smiled immediately. You used to make one whenever you accomplished something. Hyunjin blinked. I did. You believed every paper star captured a happy memory. He picked one up through the glass. When you learned to ride a bicycle, paper star. When I beat you at a board game, paper star. When we got caught playing in the rain. 3 paper stars, Felix corrected with a laugh. Hyunjin couldn't help laughing with him. Tiny fragments of those moments flickered through his mind. Not complete memories, but feelings, joy, warmth, safety. It was enough. As evening approached, the 3 of them walked to the cliff overlooking the sea. The sunset painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Waves crashed gently against the rocks below, their rhythm calm and endless. Nurse Yuna folded her hands behind her back. Do you know what your mothers always wished for? Both of them looked at her. They never hoped you'd remember every detail. She smiled. They only hoped you'd find your way back to each other. Hyunjin glanced at Felix. I think we did. Felix nodded. I think so too. Drive back to Seoul felt lighter than the journey there. For the first time in days, they talked without hesitation. They laughed over childhood habits Felix remembered. Hyunjin groaned every time another embarrassing story surfaced. You really chased pigeons because you thought they were secret messengers. Felix teased. I was 6. You apologized to a tree after climbing it. Looked lonely. Felix laughed so hard he nearly missed a traffic light. Hyunjin covered his face. Can we agree that some memories deserve to stay forgotten? Absolutely not. By the time they reached the dorm, the atmosphere between them had changed completely. The other members noticed it immediately. Changbin crossed his arms dramatically. There they are. Lino narrowed his eyes. You two smiled at each other before coming inside. Han pretended to gasp. So the Cold War is officially over. Felix exchanged a glance with Hyunjin. Instead of answering, Hyunjin walked over and threw an arm around Felix's shoulders. The room erupted into cheers. I knew it, Seungmin laughed. Bang Chan smiled quietly from the kitchen. He hadn't asked questions. He didn't need answers. Seeing both of them smiling again was enough. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Hyunjin stepped onto the dorm balcony. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the stars. A gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of rain. The balcony door slid open behind him. Felix stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I figured you'd be here. Hyunjin accepted one gratefully. Thanks. For a while they stood side by side in comfortable silence, then Hyunjin spoke. You know, I spent days asking myself, who is he? Felix smiled. And now, Hyunjin looked at him with quiet affection. Now I know, Felix raised an eyebrow. Who am I? Hyunjin laughed softly. First friend I ever had. Felix's eyes glistened. And the one who never stopped waiting. The night settled peacefully around them. There were still memories Hyunjin might never recover. There were still questions about the accident that time had buried too deeply. But those unanswered pieces no longer felt frightening. Some stories did not need every missing page to reach a meaningful ending. Sometimes, what mattered most was not remembering every step of the journey, but recognizing the person who had quietly walked beside your heart all along. As the first drops of rain began to fall once more, Hyunjin and Felix stood together beneath the night sky, no longer divided by misunderstanding, but united by a friendship that had survived distance, forgotten memories, and time itself. Their smiles returned, not because the past had been erased, but because they had finally found each other again.